Peter Harling, in my personal view, is really one of the top analysts of Middle East events. I've followed his work for many years and have found his insights and analyses to be particularly relevant, accurate, compelling, and the main reason is that he knows this region very well. He's lived in the region for many years. He's followed events on the ground. So he has a knowledge of the geography and the sociology and the politics and the people's sentiment, which is rare for an international analyst. Others do it too, but Peter does it particularly well. He's been based in the Middle East for the past 15 years, including living in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon. His areas of expertise include Syrian foreign and domestic policy, Iraqi social movements, the Lebanese political scene, and regional dynamics. He's worked with the United Nations, the Chirac Foundation, and Le Monde Diplomatique, and he served recently as an advisor to Lakhdar Brahimi when Brahimi was the joint UN Arab League Special Envoy for Syria, and he will tell us more if he wants about other things that he's done, but I'll leave that up to him. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Peter, and I turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. If my work in the region has any value added, I think it's mostly because I have many friends in the region. For having lived a rather ordinary life, which also happened to be extraordinary because of the density of events over the years. I'm happy to count Rami and Tariq among those friends, but I have friends of all walks of life and all political inclinations. And that's helped me a great deal in trying to make sense of events that at the end of the day boil down to people's lives and the uncertainties, the suffering, the day-to-day struggle they have to put up with in different ways. And that's made me extremely subjective in dealing with events in the region, and that's something I fully take on board. I have no claim to be objective, to be partial, to be above these events. On the contrary, I try to root my analysis deep within them. And part of the work I've been doing in different capacities is to re-inject a sense of humanity into punditry, if you will. And that's what I'll try to do today. I'll keep it very informal for that reason in particular. I'm extremely interested in your own reactions to what I have to say. I'm strongly opposed to live tweeting because I find it puts me on the defensive, make for a very guarded presentation, which would be a waste of time to us all. And I experienced live tweeting in a very formal context at one of these conferences where you sit in these cushy seats and speak to a large audience with huge screens on the walls that enable the speaker to see what people make of what he's just said instantaneously, and it's a very discouraging experience. I felt either like walking out or stopping my presentation and tweeting back. So I'll spare you that if you bear with me. So I currently work for the International Crisis Group, and I have for the past 10 years. Crisis Group, those who don't really know us, is a network of people like me who've spent a lot of time in the field, enjoy it, are committed, and engage with all the concerned in very pragmatic ways. We're not a human rights organization. Take a lot of blame for that because we don't necessarily take a moral stance in these conflicts. We try to understand the various perspectives and then piece them together in a broad picture, and then we try to use that analysis in terms of influencing the political debate or the policy-making process. I wouldn't take, I won't boast about our results in this part of the world when it comes to resolving conflict, which is the organization's mandate. But I do think that we've been helping produce a useful body of knowledge on what's happening in the region, mostly and sadly by documenting disaster, but hopefully an organization like that could play a more constructive role when the dynamics shift. When it comes to the Islamic State, what I've noticed is to what extent this phenomenon has been troubling to all of us, prompting very strong reactions, very emotional reactions, on the part of people involved on the ground, but also on the part of policymakers or commentators more removed from the field. I think it's something that, a phenomenon that stirs something within me, for instance, and I've been trying to come to terms with that, and I'll share my analysis, but would like to, there again, to hear your reactions in terms of what the Islamic State does to you, what it means to you. Analytically, I'll start by saying that, in my view, it filled a number of voids, gaping holes growing in the region, in terms of structures, in terms of identity, and in terms of policies. In terms of structures, the Islamic State tends to fill a gap where other players have retreated. If it took over northeastern Syria, it's mostly because the regime in Syria decided to focus its attention and its narrow resources on a more existential struggle in other parts of the country. And because there was nothing to take over in terms of a mainstream armed opposition that never really enjoyed the kind of external backing needed to impose itself as an alternative to the regime in that part of the country. If the Islamic State could take over Mosul with the very small number of fighters, I think rather little preparation and moderate logistics, it's because it pushed against a pack of cards. What you had in Mosul was two things: the security apparatus, which has become the realm of cynicism, people who are not motivated, not well trained, not well equipped, massive corruption, profound distrust vis-a-vis hierarchy and leadership, and no sense of purpose. One thing that we can notice in the region today is that people only fight for their own turf. Few players are in a position to actually project themselves into areas where they don't have a strong sense of belonging. And that was true of the security apparatus in Mosul, which had very little rooting within its immediate social environment. On the contrary, had an extremely antagonistic relationship with that environment. And the other thing was local Sunni Arab elites, which were essentially sold out to Baghdad in the context of a patron-client relationship, at the expense of their ability to represent the interest, the perspective of their purported social base. So that made it extremely easy for the Islamic State to move in and take over. So it's a movement which is benefiting from, and I think catalyzing the erosion of a number of state structures in the region. In terms of identity, and this is a theme I've developed in the past, what the Islamic State has been capitalizing on is a profound identity crisis, especially within the Sunni Arab world. Loss of any frame of reference. If you take a historical perspective, the 20th century has been an abominable century, a succession of failures. Failures at trying to redefine a future, redefine a model of governance, a form of leadership that could fill another gap which was left by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I think it's been a century of attempts at redefining the order of affairs in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire, going through very compelling intellectual movements with the Nahda and its spin-offs, the Muslim Brotherhood, various Ba'athist strands, and so on. We saw coup d'etats in the 50s leading into these forms of political emancipation vis-à-vis the colonial order, but very quickly devolving into authoritarian leadership, failing to offer a vision for the future. So all the way up to the Arab uprisings, I think, which in themselves were meant to be this moment of redemption vis-à-vis past failures, another chance. I think we've seen a region which has had to contend with this pile-up of failures, leaving it completely devastated, I think, by this latest failure, namely the Arab uprisings. And here I think the Islamic State has an ability to market an utopia, which is nothing more than an utopia, but to promote a sense of future rooted in a very deeply, how can I put it? I'll use a practical example, maybe. One of the first things that the Islamic State did after taking over Mosul was allegedly erase the border between Iraq and Syria. In reality, the border is still there, in its physical reality. It's still an object of contention between various players. It's not controlled in large parts by the Islamic State. But I found it interesting that the Islamic State would put such a focus on erasing the border in great fanfare, using rather savvy propaganda to do so. And that's because I think the theme in itself resonates in powerful ways around the region. The fact that the order of affairs artificially established by colonial powers in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire would be coming to an end is something that has resonance among many people around the region, and that's something that the Islamic State can invest in, although in practice there's very little it can do, I think, to reshape the region according to its own vision. Another practical example is the sense that with just a few pickup trucks or four-wheel drives, the Islamic State can march upon cities and conquer them. So that more or less happened in Mosul, although there was a build-up. In some ways it was predictable. But immediately the sense was that anything was possible. The next day they could march into Erbil and conquer the capital of the British regional government. Martin Dempsey, the most senior US military figure, warned against the Islamic State taking over Baghdad, although it's obviously impossible for the Islamic State to do so given its very small, very limited resources and the major challenge posed by a more motivated security apparatus in Baghdad and of course, large and professional Shiite militias defending the capital. But there is this sense that virtually anything is possible, and that I think revives the memory of the early Islamic era cavalry sweeping the region, introducing a complete, spectacular, dramatic change across the region, there again with very limited resources. The third void I wanted to mention is on a political level. I think all players in the region, and maybe we could come back to that during the discussion, have reached a form of impasse, although few of them really want to admit it. And the Islamic State came in to kind of save them of their own failures, their own limitations, gave them the opportunity to refocus on this particular theme at the expense of all others, of all the other dynamics that actually led into the emergence of the Islamic State. I think it's also been a diversion, so it's an abominable movement. I'm not trying to downplay the threat that it poses. But at the same time, I think it's being used, at least instinctively by most players, as a distraction from their own failures, as a way of reorganizing their own posture and legitimizing it without really going through the introspection needed, I think, to understand their responsibility in bringing this pragmatic development about. Now, the other big point I wanted to make is that to me, the Islamic State, although it is a very particular phenomenon, and there again, one that should be denounced in strong terms, is also something very representative, I think, of deeper and broader trends within the region. So I mentioned these growing voids. The other major trends, as I see them, is the following. And I'll mention four. One is, the first is players who tend to inflate and deflate in a very short period of time in this context of chaotic reinvention. And we've seen a number already. It concerns states and non-state players. A country like Turkey, for instance, could be the model for the region just a few years ago, and that model seems to have been swept aside by the events since 2011. We had Qatar, which was playing a central role for a few years and has been cut back to size. Possibly today the Emirates are taking over in this ability to suddenly take center stage and project themselves far and large, Libya and Iraq, way beyond their traditional sphere of influence or ambition to intervene in the region, using military and financial capacities to do so. But it also concerns a number of non-state players. Just a year ago, the Syrian PKK, the PYD, had established a state in Syria called Rojava. That was the talk of town for a while. It developed a very sophisticated narrative around the state. So we paid less attention to it because, especially in the West, because it doesn't resonate with us as the announcement of an Islamic caliphate does. But it was a major phenomenon, interesting in many ways. It hasn't completely disappeared, but it suddenly has been cut down to size, has shrunk in size. I think the Houthis in Yemen are more or less in the same situation. They have grown beyond their ability to sustain themselves. They also pushed against a pack of cards in Sana'a, captured a capital not necessarily by design, used a number of frustrations within that particular society and polity to broaden their alliances, but those alliances are not based on strong shared interests. And today inherit a state which they don't even have the financial resources to run. I mean, that would take a very different set of relationships, in particular with Saudi Arabia, to be able to support a project of governance in a country like Yemen. So I would expect the Houthis to be in that situation where today they're the talk of town. They take center stage, but will ultimately be in a position to shrink. I think you could throw in some other players, perhaps Hezbollah, which for many years was a Lebanese faction. Today is a regional power, at least behaves as such, has there again grown somewhat beyond its ability to sustain itself in the long run in such a capacity. And I think the Islamic State is very much in that situation. Today, they appear overly powerful and capable, but I doubt very much that beyond the fascination they seem to provoke among people, they have the ability to consolidate their own structures, their own funding structures, among others, but also their governance structures. I doubt they have the ability to establish the kind of rapport with people on the ground that would enable them to maintain this level of activity over the years. A second major dynamic trend in the region, I think, is a shift from movements, political movements that tended to be very hierarchical, vertical descendant, starting with an ideology, very conventional form of leadership, set of cadres charged with carrying out this vision emanating from the front. We're shifting from that, from the hierarchical, to something which is much more organic in my view. Movements who tend to represent a sentiment, confused sentiment, something that could be described as frustration, for instance, and something that takes many shapes within many different people, and which movements have this ability to tap into and build themselves back up in the bottom-up rather than a top-down dynamic. And to me, that's typical of the Islamic State. It has no clear, I mean, that's something we could discuss later on, but no clear ideology as such beyond this utopia of reviving an idealized past. It has no theory of the Islamic State, for instance. Right? Unlike the Islamic Republic in Iran, which was built on a very strong body of theory, the Islamic State has no such underpinning on a conceptual level. What it can use is all kinds of frustrations with the existing order, and that's why we see such a hybrid of a movement in terms of its recruitment base. I think we'll come back to that too. I think traditionally hierarchical, vertical descendant movements are being transformed themselves. If you look at the Syrian regime, it now is something that emanates from the populist sentiment of fear vis-a-vis any other opposition far more than it proceeds from a vision of how to end the conflict or rebuild the country. In fact, within the power structure, residual power structure in Syria, the resources, the legitimacy are vested in the ground, essentially among armed groups who report to a unified leadership, but at the same time have developed their own interests, their own capabilities, their own logic in this conflict. The third and related theme is the devolution of power in the region. I think we are witnessing forms of chaotic decentralization. And that doesn't necessarily lead to partition. It's a false alternative, a false debate to see power in the region as necessarily centralized or completely fragmented, leading to partition. I think there's a lot of room between the two, which is being explored right now, experimented with. And in a sense, you could see the Islamic State as yet another form of devolution of power. Not necessarily fundamentally different from others, Shiite militias in southern Iraq, or from what the regime has become in Syria. So they're again leaving aside, the moral standpoint of what crimes are worse than others, and trying to think more in terms of social dynamics and political movements. So to take this further, if you want to see the Islamic State as a form of local governance, they're quite interesting in that respect, because what they represent today is a network of often relatively educated individuals who communicate extremely effectively through modern technology, have taken over local governance structures, and very often co-opted people who used to work for mainstream opposition armed groups and the regime before that. And what they can do in that configuration is offer a minimal level of basic services, but do so in relatively effective ways compared to others. And that's maybe the last theme I wanted to touch upon in terms of what the deeper trends within the region. It's really the low threshold set by other players, which makes it relatively easy for the Islamic State to give itself a marginal advantage. Right? If you take a place like Deir Zor in eastern Syria, before the Islamic State, what people had to contend with was either the regime and all-out confrontation with the armed groups, or those armed groups which were to a large extent criminalized or incompetent, and certainly not focused on governance, very much competing among each other. Today you have one cohesive and quite responsive interlocutor of the Islamic State, which is certainly extremely conservative in its mores, but the people living in those areas are also, and have little to do to adjust to this new form of governance. And in terms of getting on with their lives, putting children at school, doing their business, acquiring basic staples and so on, they can find this. It's really not what they desire. In fact, I think many people in those areas, if they were given a choice between the Islamic State today and the regime as it was in 2010, would choose the regime. Only they know that the regime cannot be what it was in 2010 any longer. There's no going back. And they also know that it will take years for the regime to win, assuming it will anyway. So for the time being, they are stuck with a reality they have to adjust to, and find relatively easy to do so, given the fact that the Islamic State, unlike Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2006, 2007, is much more pragmatic in terms of dealing with its environment. They're ruthless, extraordinarily brutal against any potential Sunni Arab competitor. Thus, perhaps their biggest crimes were against some tribes standing up to them in eastern Syria and western Iraq. That's really what they focus on. But beyond that, in terms of dealing with their immediate social environment, they've proven to be relatively, more pragmatic than one would imagine, given the usual perceptions. And the last point I wanted to make before bringing this to a close is on the semantics of this phenomenon, how it presents itself, and how we deal with it. The name in itself, I find interesting. Dawla al-Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Sham. Makes no sense. It's an awkward construct. As I said, Dawla al-Islamiyya, they don't have a clear conception or theory of the Islamic State. But even beyond that, why al-Iraq wa Sham? If they want to refer to an early Islamic era frame of reference, then they would refer to Bilad al-Rafidain, Bilad al-Sham, for instance. And Tanzim al-Qaeda was more coherent in that sense in Iraq, because they used to refer themselves to Tanzim al-Qaeda, fi Bilad al-Rafidain. And that, I think, gives us a strong indication of what this movement is. Much less than something coherent, ideological, systematic. It's a pragmatic construct using a number of resources, some of them very contemporary, and others referring to imagined identities that still run very deep in the region. In our reactions to the Islamic State, I find the semantics have been very interesting too. When the Islamic State took over Mosul, in France, we referred to Rwanda. We should intervene to prevent another Rwanda at the hands of the Islamic State. In Germany, some people referred to Auschwitz. Other Europeans had Sarajevo in mind. In the Gulf, I remember an official, I think from Saudi or the Emirates, I forget, bringing the Khawarij into play. And it's as if everyone was projecting onto the Islamic State a form of national trauma that is largely irrelevant, I think, in terms of understanding the phenomenon. So to go back to my earlier point in terms of what it does to us, I think it does bring out all kinds of emotions which have played a very important role in defining policy, perhaps more so than at any given time over the past 16 years in terms of my practical experience of how events on the ground can translate into policies. So we have this bizarre conflict right now, which is very low in military intensity, and at the same time has this high-pitched tonality to it in terms of the narratives which are being developed. On one hand, you have a global coalition to fight the war on terror with God knows how many countries involved. On the other hand, you have very limited military means deployed against this enemy described as the epitome of evil. Very few strikes to hem in and push back the Islamic State in Sinjar, where it allegedly was committing genocide. Very few strikes to prevent them from taking over Erbil, assuming they ever had that intention. Again, very few strikes to bring an end to another catastrophic development expected at Mosul Dam. This notion that the Islamic State would destroy the dam to flood the whole of Iraq and kill as many people as possible. Very few strikes to stop the Islamic State from conquering Baghdad, or even in Kobani, which was about to fall, right, if you remember, a few weeks ago, and never did. So it's a very ambiguous situation on that level. There's this incredible disconnect between the narrative in terms of how much we play up this threat and how little we actually do about it. There's nothing beyond strikes. Although everybody knows, in the military in particular, that these strikes won't do much. The next steps haven't been worked out. And then there's also a very bizarre situation in the sense that many of the players on the ground have been using the Islamic State in extremely cynical ways, as I alluded to earlier on. So on the same day, the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan cry out loud that Erbil is about to fall to the Islamic State, they commit troops to conquering Kirkuk. So it has to be one of the two. Either it's an existential threat to their capital and themselves, and they would dedicate all their resources to protecting that, or they're expanding. And I think they've been a bit schizophrenic because they believe in the threat on one side, and they see it as something extremely dangerous. And at the same time, I think their traditional agenda is still structuring their course of action, and in many cases taking over. Now, we in the West are not sensitive, I think, to these nuances. We rush to aid the Kurds in Iraq on the basis that they need more weapons. Now, if they folded in Sinjar, it wasn't because they lack weapons. It was for lack of preparedness and lack of motivation. In fact, today, I think they're showing their military capabilities in various parts of Iraq, but their military presence in Sinjar was recalled. Nevertheless, we've decided to provide political support and military aid to the KRG without thinking through the consequences in terms of who that empowers vis-a-vis who within the Kurdish political struggle. There are internal rivalries in the relationship with Baghdad, how that plays out in terms of the relationship between Erbil and Tehran, and so on. So very little strategic thinking, just a knee-jerk reaction based on the narratives we want to believe in. In terms of the disconnect between the narratives and the realities of the conflict, the Islamic State itself is quite interesting. It poses as if it was there to protect the Sunnah and to push back on Shia encroachment and aggression. Now, if you take the example of Diyala, northeast of Baghdad, what you see right now happening is essentially a sectarian purge. So it's a strategically important area connecting the capital to the Iranian border, where militias are extremely active, right? Carrying out what you could describe as their military logic, but which in practice amounts to pushing out the residual presence of Sunnis from this historically mixed government. Now, the Islamic State couldn't care less about that, right? Because they are focused on consolidations in part of Iraq, which are much more important to their endurance in their view. They are not allowing themselves to be distracted in a Sunni-Shiite confrontation. Right? And other places they might, but based on very pragmatic, practical considerations more than any perpetrated hatred vis-a-vis Shiites in general, and in complete disconnect with their narrative. So I'll end on the last point, which is that the Islamic State is confronted with all kinds of ambiguities, contradictions, and limitations in the real world. And I think its response to that, its solution to this problem, is to take the struggle into the realm of imagination, into the realm of symbols, thus erasing Sykes-Picot. Another example is the fate of Western hostages. The Islamic State had garnered some 25 Western hostages of various nationalities, negotiated all those that could be sold. Took a long time to realize that some had no financial value. But it's true that the US and the UK never paid. Most people assume they claim not to pay, but do so. And finally realized that the last 6 they had, Americans and British, had no financial value, and thus used them for their symbolic value, prompting, in fact, a reaction on the part of the West, which I think offers a number of solutions to the Islamic State in terms of dealing with its limitations in the real world by taking the struggle into what I would describe as a more ritualized conflict, where we take the pose of fighting each other, but without really being at odds. So I'll stop here, and would love to hear your reactions. Especially when you feel you're in disagreement with anything. But there again, none of this I would want to describe as definitive analysis. To me, it's all trying to make sense of something that remains extremely fluid on the ground and extremely troubling to me, among others. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We'll open the floor for questions or comments. Try to make them brief, and please identify yourself. The floor is open. All right, then I will ask the first question. Oh, there you go. Hey, wait for the microphone, please, because...
Hi, my name is Chelsea Fish. I'm a law student from the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. I'm hoping that you can comment a little bit more about the Islamic State's ability to recruit people from Western countries and how that kind of fits into the idea that it's very malleable in terms of, its ideology and whatnot.
Other questions? Back there in the red.
Hi, my name is Tina Zwijnen. I'm from the University of Amsterdam and anthropology. Well, my question is more, I found it interesting how you related the identitarian, kind of the identity void as related to the Ottoman Empire and that. I think many times people tend to think of Muslims as wanting to revive this old heritage and going back in time, as opposed to a more modernized West that always looks forward. So like this discourse comes up very, very often. And I find it very interesting, but I'm also very kind of suspicious of it, like how people of today are, like, why they have this identity gap and how is it related to like 100 years ago. So if you just like can comment on it a bit more.
Any other questions? Two of them there. The lady and...
Hello, my name is Manar Hamoud, and I wanted to ask you a question about the trends. You said that it would be growing beyond the capability of sustaining itself. but it does have funding. And some journal articles do say that some locals welcome the stability provided by the Islamic State. If this is available, why would they outgrow themselves? And I was wondering if you think that they would be, since they are co-opting former Ba'athist people who were in the Ba'ath regime.
I teach international relations here at AUB. And I had a question in terms of how you might assess the US and European powers viewing the Islamic State as a security threat. There was a time where it seemed the US in particular was trying to withdraw from the region, and now in the US there's this heightened sense that this is a new kind of threat. But then you also outlined how the military campaign is quite limited, you know. So, you know, how much, yeah, I mean, I was wondering if you could sort of articulate maybe, you know, how these foreign powers are reacting. Because for me, it also strikes that is this a moment where they're coming to realize there's this kind of breakdown, I think, of the state order and governance. I mean, the rise of these non-state actors has been going on for quite a long time. And is maybe this like the fall of Mosul, maybe in particular, the beheadings and so forth, the moment where they started realizing that the political order of all these states, you know, it doesn't look like it's going to be very sustainable in the long term. While they were denying, they were deluding themselves that maybe they could just withdraw and there'd be some sort of stable authoritarian order. I'm not sure. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe I'll start with the last question. In my view, although the US has declared war on the Islamic State, nothing has changed fundamentally in US posture. This is all about preserving the US's posture as it was up to the takeover of Mosul. And what prompted a change in the narrative and the appearances was, I think, a combination of things. I mean, the decapitation of US hostages, you've seen many decapitations of other categories of people, but none had such impact in the US, obviously. And then there was this threat on, I mean, a moderate threat, not on Erbil as the capital of the Kurds, but on the US consulate in Erbil, which had to be addressed. I think the trauma of these spectacular decapitations made it possible for the US to resort to military action in defending the consulate. I mean, destroying a few Islamic State positions close to Erbil. And to me, the third thing, and that's the harshest part of my judgment, is that the prospect of a genocide in Sinjar was played up by the administration as a way not just of justifying intervention, but of redeeming themselves for their unwillingness or inability to act over the past 3 or 4 years in the face of horrific forms of violence elsewhere in the region. Suddenly the US could prevent genocide. Now at the time there was very little we knew about what was going on in Sinjar, and we could discuss whether a genocide was probable or not. I don't think the Islamic State had the resources or the intention to carry one out. But anyway, there was no such evidence, even within the ranks of the US administration. But they decided that the theme in itself had value. So today what the US has done essentially is develop what I would call a narrative about a strategy to defeat the Islamic State. And they have a very sophisticated narrative around a completely vacuous strategy. So we have military strikes that can be, I think, effective in hemming in a movement whose ability to expand is limited anyway, but cannot change the dynamics. Then in Iraq, so a clear distinction between the course of action in Iraq and in Syria, and obviously a fundamental contradiction on that level. In Iraq, the idea is to preserve the fiction of the state-building process that was taken off track momentarily by policies pursued by Nouri al-Maliki, policies whose damage can be entirely blamed on Nouri al-Maliki. So remove the prime minister, bring one in, and you can put the whole state-building process back on track. Open up the government to Sunni Arab participation, restart a political process, reverse some of the decisions that have been made over the past few years, shore up the military institution, and so on and so forth. Now, in practice, that's not what's happening in Iraq. Right? What we see is really a shift of the center of gravity away from the government and the prime minister and towards Shiite militias, which are growing and which are playing a very important role on the military front, but also in the political field. Now, I'm not saying that to pin the blame on anyone, but that's the reality, which is in no way part of the U.S. strategy, although it profoundly determines the dynamics on the ground. The U.S. objective is precisely not to recognize that, because that would mean having to completely change their posture vis-à-vis Iraq, with all kinds of knock-on effects in terms of how they deal with the Iranians and so on. So the objective for the next 2 years will be to pretend that we're still in the framework of a state-building project started in 2003, which has been through a number of crises, but is still the relevant frame of reference. And in Syria, the idea is to simply continue to find excuses not to even define a policy. The U.S. does not want to engage with the Syrian issue because it knows it will suck it in. I think Obama's instincts were always correct in that sense, but that's not to say that the U.S. can afford to be as ambiguous as it has been on Syria over the past 4 years. I think the U.S. in terms of U.S. withdrawal from the region. I mean, first of all, it's still very present militarily, and we all know that in the Gulf in particular. Still very engaged on some issues, although there are few. The Iranian nuclear file, or support to Israel, although the relationship is probably more tense and frustrating to both than it was in the past, but that relationship is still very strong. And securing transit routes in the Gulf. Now, I think really what I find interesting is to try to think through Obama's ambivalence vis-a-vis Iraq and Syria, and I think you have various layers to this ambivalence. He doesn't find, I think, the region very interesting. He doesn't find foreign affairs very interesting as a whole, but the Arab world even less so. He doesn't really see to what extent it's interesting to the U.S. Right? Where exactly, how do you define immediate U.S. interests in all this? I think there's a sense in Washington that it's about time that the region grows up and deals with its own problems. It's not always up to the U.S. to sort people out in this part of the world. And even when it tries, typically it fails, as it did in Iraq, as it did in Afghanistan. And finally, increasingly, it's more about proxy war, dirty war, long wars, and that really should belong to the past. I think someone like Obama, most of his team, has strictly no appetite in engaging in that kind of policy making. So there is a sense, I think, of disengagement on that level, which has had as a major impact, I think, the introduction of unprecedented levels of regional interference in each other's conflicts. That's really what's filling the void in terms of the diminishing Western interference. So we're still interfering, still calling Bashar to leave, toppling Gaddafi and whatnot, but in ways which are much less intelligible, decisive, consistent, resourced than in the past. And I think that's creating it's adding to the confusion and to the turmoil as other regional players, step up their role to fill that vacuum. Last point on U.S. and European powers and their posture in all this is that I tend to view policy making as quite different from what you would imagine, maybe different from what it used to be. Today, events happen on the ground. We rush to comment on them. So you start with the narrative. And that has to happen within a journalistic time frame, within 24 hours. And then we decide on a number of measures that are more or less consistent with what we just said. But typically, what we said half-heartedly and on the spur of the moment, and our economies are in bad shape. We don't really believe in military intervention as we used to. Concepts like, regime change, state building, and so on have been, even humanitarian intervention have been taken with battering of late. So we'll take half measures to support a half-hearted statement. And then we'll try and figure out if that can help serve some interests. Right? So the whole policy-making process, which we do, you would assume rests on defining interests, refining your reading of events on the ground, and looking at what measures are available, developing a policy on that basis, and then wrapping it all up in a narrative used to legitimize your course of action. I think this whole process has been turned on its head. In terms of IS recruitment in the West, no, I'm not sure what to say because we're still in the very early stages. It's something that's massive. Take a country like France, which I originate from. The numbers are striking in themselves. We had 10 French jihadis tracking all the way to Afghanistan over a number of years. And we had as many in Iraq until recently, in the whole early stages of the US occupation. And we have about 1,000 identified French citizens who have joined the Islamic State within a relatively short period of time. So I'm not sure what that tells us about. Does it tell us something about the Islamic State and its malleability, as you said, or something about our own societies, which are going through an existential crisis of their own? Does it tell us something about the state of the region right now, which is more of a magnet than it ever was? We've seen in the region, I think, forms and levels of violence which are out of this world, which in the West, I think, we don't really fully appreciate, because the Arab world has always been a mess. It's always been about sex and tribes fighting each other and so on. So I'm not sure that that public opinion or even policymakers in places like Paris, London, who are fatigued with anything Arab, really realize to what extent these forms and levels of violence are unprecedented. And I think unprecedentedly dangerous. But for other people in our societies who follow events on the ground and through, of course, very biased media, they are faced with extreme forms of injustice, things which are unbearable. So I think that resonates with people who are frustrated with the state of affairs in France and elsewhere for all kinds of reasons. But the level of injustice they can witness in looking at the region, I think, can prompt a reaction whereby they express their confused sense of frustration by trekking to the region. Now, one thing that's changed also a great deal is how easy it is to join the Islamic State. Foreigners within the Islamic State can live the jihadi romantic trip, which was not possible in Afghanistan, which was not possible in Iraq. Right? In Afghanistan, you had people traveling mostly from the region who had been through years of ideological preparation, who would be trained militarily in the context of an operation which was bankrolled and organized with state backing. And then injected into a very tough environment in Afghanistan. In Iraq, you had something quite different. You had people coming from the region, but also from the West, traveling to fight originally the US occupation, then it turned into more of a sectarian struggle. But it had bigger numbers, but it was difficult still to go to Iraq. You'd have to go through Syria, you'd pay a high price, you'd be manipulated by security services and whatnot, and then you'd end up in Iraq. And the Iraqi fighters who dominated the insurgency had no time for foreigners. It had to be hidden, they had to be fed, trained, equipped. And the insurgency was under a lot of stress anyhow. So these foreigners were a burden, and that's what prompted the development of this industry of suicide bombings, which very much characterized the insurgency in Iraq for that reason. So foreigners were given no other option than to serve as fodder and not as fighters. In Syria, it's completely different. I mean, especially now, it's more difficult to transit through Turkey and so on. But until recently, you could just take a bus in Paris, or Amsterdam, Belgium, and make your way to Istanbul, and then cross the border. And the first thing you do, take a selfie. It's kind of wireless jihad. You're completely integrated into the digital sphere, so you never really leave your family and your friends back at home. Syrian society, welcoming as it is vis-à-vis foreigners, offered much more of a pleasant environment to even jihadis, and they could take their place within the jihadi movement as fighters. They were really given that space. I think they're not good fighters, they're probably even worse than the others. But they have been able to compensate for that in other ways. One is that they're savvy communicators. I think they understand our set of values, the problems our societies are going through very well, and can use that at least instinctively. And I think they've also been compensating through ultraviolence. It's not. To me, it's revealing that the decapitations were at the hands of foreign volunteers. I mean, Western volunteers trying to prove their stuff. And in fact, there's an interesting anecdote when it comes to the Western hostages. They were held for the first few months by Moroccans, and then they switched to Brits. And the Moroccans were treating them very well, in some respect, but were incapable of negotiating. Whereas the Brits were very good negotiators with our security services in the West, because we share the same language, the same set of values, and so on. We can do business together. At the same time, they started maltreating their prisoners. And most of the prisoners had become converts, right? And they were torturing those who were most pious, in particular. So Fale, for instance, who was the most pious of all, was the person who was constantly harassed and tortured by these people detaining them, because they had to create a difference between themselves and their prisoners, although there was none. Right? So they had to artificially dehumanize them in order to preserve that difference. And I think that's really the threat is not, I think, a threat which is major in terms of how security services will deal with it. It's large numbers, people who are difficult to profile, but my sense is that they're so well integrated into the digital sphere that the security services can keep track of them. But the problem is really what it tells us about our own societies. What happened yesterday in Paris just exacerbates this malaise. And the danger there, I think, is our reaction to that particular threat. And instead of really asking ourselves about what our societies are going through, simply to focus on the Islamic State and pin all the blame on Muslim extremism and continue to look away from our own problems. In terms of the deflation of the Islamic State, I don't think they're going to disappear. I simply believe that today they're the talk of the day. If you look at the past 4 years, they've been incredibly dense, right? Over 4 years, we've jumped from one theme to the next. It was instant democracy, great skepticism in the very early stages of the uprising in Tunisia, then instant democracy spread to Egypt, and in the West we carried the idea over into regime change in Libya, and of course making dramatic statements on Syria. And you went through a succession of themes with the humanitarian crisis and the use of chemical weapons and so on and so forth. I think what's going to happen in the period to come is similar. So the Islamic State is the dominant theme today. I doubt very much it will be a year or two from now. Probably we will have moved on. And that's my biggest concern. They'll still be there. They'll still be, just another part of this multi-layered problem. But we'll jump onto the next distraction to save us from that failure, as every other theme of the past 4 years came to save us from the previous one. Meanwhile, all these problems are just adding up into an ever more intricate and dangerous situation. And the last question, I think, here was on the identity crisis. I mean, I find it difficult to have a clear analysis on identity issues. Generally, and I think I understand your skepticism. What I would maybe really stress, as I tried to earlier on, is this sense of failure. The legacy of a succession of failures, and in particular military defeats. It's not just the failures of forms of leadership, models of government, promises, ideological promises of emancipation and so on. It's also a number of military defeats. And I think that played a big role in the fascination the Islamic State could exercise. Kind of reverses. I think it did in the early stages, and I think the Islamic State there again, it can benefit from this huge sense of fatigue and frustration in the region and cynicism, but is also exposed to a backlash for that same reason. Right? Just as Hezbollah in 2006 could become a kind of beacon promise for the region, and then disappoint later on. At least not everyone, but many. I think the Islamic State can have the same impact. Exactly. Suddenly they offer a glimmer of change, of redemption to some people, but I don't think they have an ability to deliver on that for very long. And I think they're very much part of this moment of part of this sense of failure.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Over here. Let me ask one in the meantime. How do you see the relationship or the genealogy between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State?
Thank you. Omar Abdulaziz Khalaji. A year ago, the Islamic State was facing, in Iraq and the Levant, was facing a series of defeats. The Syrian rebels have managed to convince the leaders of the rebels have managed to convince their rank and files that the ISIL was a Khawarij institution, and as such was a legitimate target for fighting. And they actually managed to make major pushes in western Syria against it. And at some point, there was very strong advances for the other non-state actors, the small non-state actors in eastern Syria as well. So the outlook at the time was that ISIL was not a very strong entity. And then all of a sudden there was the move on Mosul, which was organized primarily by various Sunni actors, of which ISIL was probably the most dominant. But then soon ISIL capitalized on that movement to silence all other oppositions, so picking up fights with some of the smaller tribes to make an example of them among the other tribes, slaughtering the Shaitat, slaughtering the others, making quick pushes with very bloody consequences for anybody who resisted. And then all of a sudden, within a few months, we have an institutional structure that is capable of providing governance more or less at the same rate the regime was providing in pre-2011 rates, more or less, in the rural parts at least, maybe not in the big cities. A level of funding which calculated makes approximately $200 per capita per person in the rural areas. Not a small amount of money. Translated, this is roughly approximately $150 million a month. These are large sums, and if we calculate the amount of oil that's still available in the region, the kind of symbolic taxes that ISIL is collecting, the level of sort of local resources from the crossings, the archaeological digs or whatever, that still makes a gap of about $100 million a month being paid somewhere from outside of the local resources, in Syria at least. That is a major transformation all of a sudden of a medium-sized, let's say, stakeholder in the Syrian conflict, Syrian-Iraqi conflict, to become a big-size player. The movement of a few hundred pickups from one place to another, obviously when they started moving to western Syria, west of Manbij towards Mar'a, there was certainly some attacks from the air by coalition forces to prevent them, but nobody prevented them from getting to Mosul. The narrative of something that grew up all of a sudden is just simply does not add up. There's something that is being funded from the outside. There's state and non-state actors that are funding. And I think we need to understand a little bit the implications of how ISIS is repositioned from a geopolitical frame of mind, simply by looking at what they are capable of doing. The level of governance they're providing in their areas is more or less congruent with the type of narratives that have been published in the kind of pamphlets that were circulating in the Salafist jihadist circles, starting from the Jama'ah Islamiyah in Libya, the various narratives that Al-Qaeda groups were circulating in Syria and other places. So they have a more or less a reference in terms of governance structures, but that doesn't explain all of a sudden the very structured implementation mechanisms that go well beyond any typical simplistic narratives of Husba that were circulating. So that geopolitical framework, I think we need to understand. I think we need to critically examine. I don't think the issue of representing the American disengagement with the region is sufficiently enough to explain it.
Any others? Okay.
I'll try to answer these two questions or comments simultaneously. In terms of the genealogy, going back to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? I think the starting point is the debacle of 2007 and its causes. The jihadi Al-Qaeda linked movement in Iraq essentially self-destructed, or at least created context which the US could use to destroy. Now, if it self-destructed, it wasn't simply because of decisions it made on its own. I mean, to me, it was the result of the decapitation campaign carried out by the US in previous years. Al-Qaeda in Iraq started off, as many other small jihadi movements elsewhere in the Arab world, in the 90s, for instance, around a charismatic fighter who had considerable hands-on experience, a certain ideological credibility, namely Zarqawi, of course. But around him, he had a number of people, a body of cadres, if you will, of sharing a similar background. And they shifted the struggle away from fighting the US towards fighting what we describe as a Shiite occupation. The US focused on eliminating that layer of leadership within Al-Qaeda and was very successful, in fact, at taking them out one after the other, causing the ascent of a new generation, which was mostly Iraqi, relatively experienced, but homegrown, and with less charisma, less of a vision also. But they were also eliminated by the US, and what you had is younger and younger Iraqis, sometimes 20 years old, 18 years old, taking over leadership positions on a local level within the movement at a time when it was extremely powerful and influential. But they had no military training, they had no political vision, they had no religious credibility whatsoever, and they just turned completely to ultra-violence, turning it away from the struggle against Shiite occupation and towards bullying their own immediate environment. Al-Qaeda was very involved in assassinations of local notables. Anybody with a diploma would be susceptible to being killed. Any figure within a local tribe. They also tried to impose themselves through forced marriage with daughters of tribal leaders and so on. So they created that context whereby their immediate environment rejected them to the point that the US could invest in the Sahwat, the awakenings. The US could not invent, not fabricate the awakenings. It was really a product of Al-Qaeda itself. Anyway, the jihadi movement came to two conclusions when it comes to that debacle. It had two components in Syria, one of which concluded that you had to cultivate your environment and develop alliances, prove your value added, cater for ordinary people around you for fear of betrayal. And that was the Jabhat al-Nusra strand, line of thought. And the other line of thought was to say you have to crush any potential Sunni-Arab competitor before he can betray you, and he will. And that was the Daesh kind of mentality. Now, indeed, I think Daesh didn't, Islamic State didn't appear out of nowhere and overnight. It was a build-up as a result of the evolution within the Syrian opposition, with progressive radicalization that took over, laying the groundwork. There was some form of manipulation on the part of the regime. That's true. I don't think that the Islamic State is a creation of the regime, but certainly some individuals were let go or let free, although they had been detained for years and considered particularly nefarious and so on. You had a role played by Nouri al-Maliki in radicalizing his opposition in Iraq, precisely because he didn't want to address any of their legitimate demands. And although in that case, unlike Syria, the protest movement was extremely peaceful in the early stages, precisely because Iraqis had tried to learn the lessons from the Syrian disaster and didn't want to go down that road. But policies pursued by Nouri al-Maliki made sure that attempt to remain peaceful was just as untenable in Iraq as it had been in Syria. So what we saw, really was an Al-Qaeda type movement in Iraq which had been reduced to hardly anything. The French groups, that had sought refuge in very remote parts of the Iraqi desert in the West, that had virtually no ability to operate even within Iraqi society, were profoundly rejected. We saw those groups gradually reassert themselves and reconnect to their society, and that was a process. When the Islamic State took over, asserted itself in Fallujah, for instance, as a result of Nouri al-Maliki's policies, the reactions in Fallujah were extremely ambivalent. People didn't want them there, but they needed them to push back on the government, and this is something we documented quite clearly. So, a number of cities fell to the Islamic State long before Mosul, Raqqa, Fallujah, and so on. You could really draw that itinerary. And in terms of the geopolitical framework and who played what role to what extent, you could blame Syrian regime, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran. I really have nothing to share on that because it will be speculation. I feel that what has changed is precisely, I can't prove it, but that this is a jihadi movement that has unprecedented levels of independence vis-a-vis traditional funding structures, whether state-sponsored or tapping into the resources of the Islamic sphere. I do believe that the Islamic State benefited from private funding, coming from the Gulf, for instance, in the early stages, but I sense that they don't need it today, and that they have really focused on acquiring that autonomy, which is their greatest source of strength today. So oil has clearly been a part. And also, I think the governance model and the way they levy taxes, for instance. They don't bully businessmen. They let them do their business, but they levy taxes.
Very minimal.
No, exactly.
Doesn't make that kind of money.
Yeah. One last point I will make, if this is coming to an end, is that in the region right now, the name of the game is an arms race. I think there's a need to bring this up systematically. A variety of players are committed or engaging half-heartedly in proxy war, supporting all kinds of factions on the ground, whose presence and whose growth is further undermining what exists of state structures in Iraq, in Syria. I think it's true in Lebanon and perhaps beyond. And the Islamic State has come to catalyze this arms race. Now virtually anything's possible. Sending weapons to anyone is justified. And I think that's something you pay a price for over a long period of time. So at a time when everybody seems to be developing these sophisticated narratives completely disconnected from realities on the ground, I find it important to name that game. And the name is an arms race.
I think we've come to the end of our talk. And, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to the IFI staff for arranging this.